Hey guys, and welcome back to my review of the new Transformers Earthrise War for Cybertron Voyager class Earth Mode Starscream. Taking a very quick look at the packaging, we can see here that we actually have a rather underwhelming piece of artwork of Starscream, obviously based on his Earth Mode appearance. We can see that the colouring that they've gone with on this actual piece of box art is a lot more subtle and definitely a lot more muted compared to the actual colours of the figure. When we flip around to the back of the packaging, we've got some product shots of the figure in robot mode as well as his vehicle mode, and also some compatibility with Battle Masters. And then finally on the other side of the packaging, we have that really awesome piece of Earthrise artwork. And then just flipping up to the top of the box, here we have an image of Galvatron. And here we have Earthrise Starscream opened up and as he comes packaged in his robot mode. Now when this figure was first unveiled last year, I actually had real high hopes for this release. I wasn't necessarily thrilled with the Siege version that we got of Starscream. I thought that it did have some nice nods to the G1 design. However, I didn't really like the figure. I didn't think it was that groundbreaking of a figure, and it really was something that we'd seen previously with other Starscream releases. So when we got this figure shown, and it looked absolutely fantastic when it was first unveiled, I was actually incredibly excited for it, especially when I found out that this would actually be basically a rework, much like they did with the Studio Series Starscream, a rework of a pre-existing deluxe class Starscream, that obviously being the classic Starscream, just bringing it up to the more modern scale of a Voyager class and giving it a much more updated and refreshed transformation sequence to actually add some additional elements that they weren't able to add on that original deluxe. However, unfortunately, upon having this figure in hand, I can't help but feel ever so slightly underwhelmed by it, and that's not necessarily down to its overall aesthetic. It's more to do with the articulation that this figure presents itself with. Now, just giving you a quick 360-degree look of this new Earthrise Starscream, there's no denying that this is exactly what we saw in the G1 cartoon. It definitely brings a lot of those G1 aesthetics and modernizes it for this new Earthrise line. However, there are some issues with this figure that I'm really not a fan of. Most noticeably is that I do not like how the entire nose cone just hangs off of the back. It doesn't even peg in anywhere. It just literally dangles there. It just sits and could be rotated up nor down. And it's not necessarily a deal breaker for me. I just wish they could have engineered it in a way so that this actually became the front cockpit that we see in the front of Starscream's robot mode. Now, another aspect of this figure that I'm majorly let down by is the fact that there is no waist articulation nor wrist articulation on this figure. That is something that I think is a significant drawback, and I've found myself really wanting to just utilize the waist joint on this figure, considering that Starscream is indeed a rather agile character. Now, taking a detailed look at the figure's head sculpt, there is no denying that that is the G1 Starscream. Personally, I do actually prefer the head sculpt on this new Earthrise Starscream when compared to that of the Siege version. I really like the glossy black paint apps that they've used for the main helmet section of this, and we've got a nice silver paint app and red paint app for both the mouth plate and the eyes of Starscream. We've got some nice surface detailing. I really do like the torso area as well, specifically these sections here where these turbines are. That looks really cool and has been painted super nicely as well. We can see here that we do have some of the actual cockpit from the jet mode actually situated within the torso. I just wish they found a way to actually compress this here and have this also embedded within the torso as well. But taking a look at what I have in front of me, it's not too bad. It's just something that I wish they had included. I really like the null rays on this figure, definitely a lot more than I liked the ones on the Siege figure. I think that they look a lot more streamlined and definitely a lot slimmer than the rather thicker ones that we got on the Siege figure. I do like the wings of Starscream. I do like how there is this added hinge to give them an extra flare. However, I do wish they could have been risen and lowered much like the Siege version, which once again is something which is absent on the Earthrise release. As we turn our attention down to the lower torso region of the figure, we can of course see loads more detailing. I do like the blue paint apps on the shins, as well as these slight darker gunmetal grey paint apps here. Here it almost looks as if though these are vents perhaps from his alt form, so that's rather nice to see. And I do like the paint apps on the actual feet as well. So it's not a bad figure, it's just definitely not as good as I was necessarily expecting it to be. In terms of articulation, the head is on a great ball joint, allowing the figure to look up and down. It can nod side to side as well as rotate the full 360. The arms can hinge out to the sides as well as rotate 360 on a mushroom peg joint. However, they are slightly restricted due to this section here. Just where the bicep is, he can do full 360 range of motion. He has roughly a single joint of motion. It's just over 90 degrees of bend at the elbow, which is something which once again the Siege was able to pull off a double joint. There is no wrist articulation whatsoever, and I think they could have perhaps engineered one in there. This whole piece here is hollow, so if they could have thickened that out and actually put a swivel joint in there, we definitely could have got a wrist rotation on this figure. Waist articulation, seeing as how this figure transforms, I don't think that they could have implemented it with the figure being how it is now. Perhaps if they'd opted to go with a different route with the whole conversion of the torso, maybe they could have had added waist rotation, but as it stands, it is just a solid piece. This crutch plate here is able to move forwards and backwards, and with it doing so, you can kick the leg out to that degree, which is not even a 90-degree bend of motion. It can kick backwards that far before it bumps into this lower skirt piece. He can do the splits to about that degree, which once again isn't a great deal of motion. This section here can rotate the full 360, and you are able to get a 90-degree bend of motion out of the actual knee joint. And then finally, really surprisingly, he does actually have quite a significant degree of motion at the ankle, which I'm glad that they implemented, as once again this is something that they could have skimped out on. So whilst articulation isn't necessarily bad, it's just not up there with what we've seen in some of the previous lines, nor from some of the other Earthrise and Siege figures. For a quick Voyager size comparison, here we have the new Earthrise Starscream compared next to the Voyager Megatron, as well as the Siege version of Starscream. Just quickly comparing these two, I do think they scale rather nicely. It's always great to see Megatron being taller than Starscream, as he really should be. So in terms of a scale between these two, I think it works absolutely perfectly. But of course, the comparison you'll all want me to go into a more in-depth analysis of is between the Earthrise Starscream and the Siege figure. Now, upon looking at them, aesthetic-wise, I do prefer the overall look of the Earthrise version. I was never really a fan of the whole Tetrajet aesthetic that the original Siege Starscream went with. However, I've got to say the articulation on this is leaps and bounds better than the articulation on this figure. He does have double joints at the elbows, which isn't something which is across the board for Siege and Earthrise, but it was a nice inclusion nonetheless. This figure does have waist articulation, which is also fantastic to see, and this figure is also able to raise his wings up, which honestly you are going to find yourself wanting to do when you get this figure. It's great that you can hinge these sections back, but I really think they should have been able to be on a hinge joint, allowing them to move up ever so slightly, just to allow for some more dynamic poses and a different display option. As a whole, if I had to pick between either of the two, I would probably opt to go with the Earthrise version, just as I do prefer the overall look, but in terms of playability and the overall functionality of the joints, I definitely do vastly prefer the Siege Starscream, just in terms of how well articulated it is. Now, in terms of transformation, this figure does transform in a whopping 30-step transformation, but believe me, it's definitely not as complex as the instruction manual makes it out to be upon first glance. First of all, you're going to want to fold the wrist in, I'd say to that degree of motion, and then just lift this section up here. This will then allow you to push this whole section inwards, and then fold this over the top, and then fold the wrist up. And that is effectively the arm transformation for this side of Starscream fully completed. And we just want to repeat the same process here for this side. So once again, just open all of this up, and then push this inwards, clip that down, and then fold this up as well, and fold that up. Quite frankly, the instructions make you do a hell of a lot more steps than you actually need to do. So as long as you stick by this formula, you'll get the exact same outcome, just like this. Now, what you're going to want to do is take this whole nose cone and just bring it over Starscream's head and tab it into place like this. Now, what we can do is one of my least favorite parts of the transformation is actually separate this torso plate from the main body. This is definitely something I can see breaking over time, as you have to flex this tab over this section and do it on both sides in order to pry it away from the main body. I really wish that there was a more elegant way of actually doing that, but unfortunately this is what we're stuck with. We can then bring this section up and rotate this around, and then you're just going to want to push the nose cone through until it tabs into place. We can then take the arms now and fold those inwards, and with that done, we can bring this back together and peg it into place. And that's more or less the entire front nose cone region of Starscream fully completed. Now what we're going to want to do is come to the toes and just collapse these on both sides. We're going to turn our attention to these ankle rockers, hinge those out, lift this section up, and this tab here will actually plug into this slot. So fold the ankle rocker joint in again and tab that into place, fold out this tail fin wing, repeat the same process here on this side, so just fold that out, peg that in, fold out the wing, come to these two sections and tab those together. Now we can pull the front shin pieces of this away, lift up the crutch plate, and you're just going to want to collapse all of this in upon itself, and whilst at the same time ensure that these tabs here peg into the slots which are situated on the tops of the legs. So just give that a nice firm push. It may resist you first of all, but as long as you give it a nice firm tab, it should stay in there rather securely. Fold this up and then fold this back down. And now we come to, once again, another one of my least favorite parts of transformation. Not necessarily going into jet mode, but going back into robot mode. These mushroom pegs are so prone to popping off. And that's due to there being literally minimum clearance between the tabs and how you're actually supposed to overlay them on the transformation. As I stated, it's a lot easier going from robot to jet mode, but once you go from jet to robot mode, there really is no chance of you transforming this without these mushroom pegs popping off, unless you're incredibly delicate, which just makes the transformation that ever so slightly more tedious. We can then tab this final tab in, and there we effectively have the Transformers Earthrise Voyager Starscream transformed and in his F-15 jet mode. Now we can turn to the underside and take his null rays and of course peg these into the base of the jet. And I've got to say that I actually really like the jet mode on this Starscream. It's very G1 accurate and definitely does evoke that G1 look that we saw within the cartoon. I think it's an absolute fantastic looking alt form. I love the cockpit area, and we've also got some detailings of actually seats in there as well. I like all this panel lining as well, the Decepticon insignias, incredibly crisp paint apps for the white and red stripes, as well as on the actual tail wings themselves. As we turn to the underside, not really much in terms of undercarriage than you would necessarily suspect. I don't really like this huge gaping hole here, however that is of course for transformation. If they were to give this figure landing gear, I think that definitely would have helped the overall look, but definitely a really nice and very elegant looking jet mode, and quite honestly I'm undecided on whether or not I prefer this figure as a jet or as a robot. And then for a very quick size comparison, here we have the Earthrise Starscream compared next to the Siege Voyager class Starscream, which is of course based on his Cybertronian Tetrajet appearance. We can see here that they are vastly different in terms of alt forms. Despite the overall aesthetic more or less being the same in robot mode, we have all of the same sort of iconic traits of Starscream both present in the robot mode, but they all have very different jet modes, which is incredible to see. And as I stated, I do prefer this in terms of a jet when compared next to this Tetrajet version. I just think that this looks a lot more cohesive with what I'm more familiar with in terms of Transformers, rather than this very obscure alien type of jet, which is of course from Cybertron. But just for a very quick comparison, despite them being more or less exactly the same height in terms of robot mode, the Siege version is definitely significantly more smaller and definitely a lot more squat in its appearance when compared to that of the Earthrise version. So that was my review on the newly released Transformers War for Cybertron Earthrise Starscream. Personally, I actually do quite like this figure, despite me not necessarily liking some of the design choices such as the lack of a waist joint, the lack of wrist articulation and the nose cone hanging on the back. For the most part, I do think this is quite a solid Voyager. The plastic quality feels incredibly dense, definitely very durable, which is great to see. Transformation is quite fun going from jet mode and to robot mode. However, these wings being on mushroom pegs can be an issue and can definitely mess up the continuity and fluidity of the overall process. With all that being said, jet mode 2 is incredibly sleek and definitely borrows some elements from that classic Starscream that was released way back when. I personally do quite like this figure, but it definitely didn't live up to my initial expectations. But with all that being said, it's still a great addition into the Earthrise line, and it'd be great to see some of the other Siege figures get a makeover for Earthrise to give them a more traditional Earth mode appearance. I hope you enjoyed this review. If you did, please let me know down in the comment section below, and be sure to let me know what you think of this figure also down in the comments. Thanks for watching.